5,
4,
3,
2,
1. But who's counting, right?
And his name is Major.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen,
please welcome Major Garrett.
From the nation's capital.
Major, fantastic.
It's The Takeout.
This is a major achievement.
With CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent,
Major Garrett, yes, CBS, yes, hi.
Major Garrett.
Major, that's nonsense, and you should know better.
Is Major out of the doghouse?
The answer is yes.
Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. You know, we are winding to a close of the year 2022, and this episode is going to be particularly special for me because it's about a topic I love. Maybe it's a topic you love too. It's a podcast, not this one. There's no podcast I love more than this one. You know that, my dear friends. But it's very close. Mobituaries. Mobituaries is the beautiful, luminous journalistic work of Mo Rocca. Mo, it's great to see you. Thanks for being with you. And I mean this. It is an amazing achievement. I love every episode. I immerse myself in every episode, and I am enriched by every episode. I'm just going to fanboy on you for like the next 45 minutes, if that's okay.
It is totally fine. And I did bring my wallet, by the way, unless this is...
No. Dinner is always on us here at the Takeout. So,
right.
Speaking of that, we are in New York City. Trattoria del Arte. Want to do that for me?
I think that was...
Is that okay? That was like passable.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about Mobituaries. You're midway through season 3.
Uh-huh.
The second part of season 3 will start right about when 2023 starts.
Yep.
For those who may not know about this wonderful place to find great stories about Americans who've been slightly overlooked or maybe heavily overlooked, what is the construct? What is the premise, the passion behind Mobituaries?
So it's people or things. In this season, we even included a fruit that deserve a second look, that passed on and didn't get the recognition that I think they deserved. And then they also, what is that?
Octopus calamari braised.
Oh, I love that.
How special is that? And Mo Rocca, that will be all yours.
Yes, I know. Well, because you saw the dog. Oh, what is it? Oh, that's great. Oh, the burrata.
So
and thank you for adding the anchovies, because burrata is nothing without anchovies. Okay. Oh, that would be great.
Please,
thank you
go
so
right
much.
ahead.
Thank
Yes,
you very
indeed.
much.
This is an indulgent culinary experience entirely for Mo
Sure, a
Rocca.
little bit of well, yeah. I'm guessing you saw the documentary about the octopus, right? That everybody that
I
made
see all the documentaries on octopus.
yeah, and so that's why I have not. I'm waiting to see it until after I eat this.
Okay, very good.
So it's basically things that I think deserve a second look, that didn't get the send off they deserved the first time, or maybe didn't get any send off at all. So already this season we had John Denver, we had names,
yes.
And I'm sorry that we didn't include Major, because that would have been really interesting actually. Do you know where it ranks, Major?
Very, very low.
Yeah.
Very, very. It does not make the top 10,000, I don't think, ever.
Yeah.
But that's been an advantage for me, so I'm good with that.
It probably is. So yeah, so we looked at names like Mildred, Bertha, and Todd, which fell off the map. I was surprised that Todd had fallen off the map in the early 70s. So it's been a blast just to kind of dive into these different topics.
And what strikes me about this second look process is, in some instances, the subject matter got a look, like John Denver, for example. John Denver, in his time, was a sensation.
Yeah.
And the treatment of it this time was, he's different than the caricature or the popular understanding of what John Denver was.
Well, you know, I don't know if you remember this. And look, it might have just been in my own little tiny corner of the world, but when he died, and we didn't mention this in the podcast, but I remember a lot of like really snarky jokes about him.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of the same way as a child that I remembered when Elvis died. The very first time I heard the word loser was on the playground at Woodacres Elementary School in Bethesda, Maryland. And Elvis had died, I guess, in the summer. And when showed up
August,
in third grade, and somebody mentioned Elvis, and this girl said he was a loser. And
Whoa.
And
not exactly.
Right. No, exactly. But John Denver had come to this place where he'd sort of become a punchline. And so I thought, well, this is rich, because I'm not the only one telling Alexa to play John Denver's greatest hits. A lot of people are doing this.
Correct.
And Kurt Cobain, apparently, when he grew up, his mother only had one album in the house, and it was the John Denver's greatest hits, and he listened to it over and over again.
And I was probably, Mo Rocca, sympathetic to that retelling of the John Denver story because I think that's what's going to happen when Neil Diamond dies. And I'm a huge Neil Diamond fan, an unapologetic Neil Diamond fan. I believe he is an exceptional songwriter. His latter part of his career is a little bit kitschier than the first part of his career, but I think he's a substantial member of the American songbook, and he's not treated that way. He's not regarded that way, and I think whatever that day comes, it will be a sequined reference and a lot of ribbing of people in the side. Well, that guy was really kind of just a low-level entertainer. Not true.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, I mean, people at Fenway would right?
Yes,
because
Fenway would love it
he's
because it's Sweet
revered.
Caroline.
Yeah, but
they would also just regard that as like a baseball song. No, it's actually a really good song in itself.
Well, I think you're right, and I think this is what happens. It seems like with a lot of really, really mass appeal entertainers, and of course, it's foolish. Like the audience is smart; they attach themselves to something for a good reason. People punch through not by accident,
and. The process of a mobituary is to tell the story of a person's life in the context of the times in which they lived it. Not our modern times, because some of the issues and some of the people are viewed maybe more harshly now than they were in the time in which they lived, or they were subject to pressures unlike the pressures they would face now. Back in season 2, there's a tribute to really one of the greatest entertainers ever, Sammy Davis Jr.
Right.
And that story is about his time, his struggles, and how he moved through them.
Yeah, I think I like to try to go back and help the audience understand how the person was received in their time. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, there's a point of view, so I mean, I can't. It would be a cheat for me to say, "Oh, we're not judging them by contemporary standards." That's not true, but I also don't want to look. When we did Latin Lovers in the first half of this season, Valentino, Ramon Navarro, Fernando Lamas. You know, Valentino's 100 years before Me Too. Okay, and so I get it. A lot of these movies haven't dated well.
Correct.
But 83% of moviegoers were women at the time, and he was created by women. I mean, the matinee idol was created by women who, at that time, you know, that's what they wanted. And so I didn't feel like digging up women that have been dead for 70 and 80 years and putting them on trial. I mean, for like what they liked. Exactly. I think it's, you know, it's sort of, this is what was at the time. And of course, you know, we add a little bit of like my viewpoint on it, but I'm interested in what created this phenomenon at the time. Why people were literally killing themselves when he died because there was such hysteria.
And tastes are tastes. And one of the ways to understand how a culture evolves is to understand tastes of a different era.
Totally. Yes.
And if you don't understand the tastes of a different era, you can't mark yourself in how things have changed.
Exactly.
And one of the ways of appreciating and sort of quantifying change and evolution is, well, what were the tastes back then and why?
Mm-hmm. How did we get here? And also, I don't think most people are that judgmental anyway. Right. I don't think most people are sitting there going, "Oh, that's so terrible." I mean,
there is a sort of self-defined judgment or judgmental industrial complex, but most people are not a member of it.
That's hysterical. The judgmental industrial complex is perfect. That's perfect. Yeah, yeah.
But most people don't count themselves in that, and they want to know, like, for example, going back to John Denver, I didn't realize until I listened, not only did he have a successful songwriting career, but, and we'll talk more about this on the other side of the break, he had one of the most watched Christmas specials in the history of broadcast television.
Yes. Yes, I mean it's not quite the level of, say, my podcast or yours.
No.
65 million people tuned in to the Rocky Mountain Christmas special in 1975, and you know, when I found it, you can find it on YouTube. I'm not sure it's supposed to be there, but it is. And, you know, you and I are not far apart in age, and so you can smell the 70s just by listening to this thing. It is so evocative of kind of a weird sort of wan kind of energy. You know, John Denver, it's sort of, there are scenes of nature. There's a slow-mo shot of a flying squirrel. There's a sequence on the life cycle of the brook trout.
And we're going to hold on the brook trout and all the other scenery because we need to go to break.
Do we have brook trout coming, by the way?
Maybe
because
the
I
brook
need
trout
some
will
fish,
be on its
some more
way.
fish with the
Mo
octopus
Rocca,
and squid.
Major Garrett, segment 2 of the Takeout, coming up in just a second.
They're sitting somewhere in the back of our minds, and then if you bring them up, people go, "Oh my God, that's right! I loved that person."
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to segment 2 of the Takeout, Trattoria del Arte in Midtown Manhattan. Our special guest, Mo Rocca. And I am just going to fanboy for the next 40 minutes because it's about Mobituaries. It's about this phenomenal podcast that grew out of your work on CBS Sunday Morning and this gathering of information, observation, and archival sound that brings to life people who deserve a second look. And we'll get back to the John Denver Christmas special from 1976 in a second, but you are the editorial agent of control over who gets the second look, are you not?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you feel this way too. I just feel like I've learned to trust my gut. I don't want that in a leader necessarily, but like for editorial,
Right.
you know, if something gets me in the gut, I think there's something about, say, John Denver that, and I mentioned this in the podcast, this is going to be a name drop, but I participated in a reading that a friend put on, a playwright, and Julianne Moore was there, and she sat right next to me. It was really cool, and my friend was being very nice and said, "Oh, Julianne, you have to listen to Mo's podcast, Mobituaries." He explained what it was, and she said, "Who do you have coming up?" And I said, "John Denver," and she melted. She went, "Oh, John Denver," and she like was. It's sort of like she stepped into a time machine right there and went back and was just exhaled and I think that there's something that makes people. He's what I call an undervalued stock, and I think there are people like that they're sitting somewhere in the back of our minds, and then if you bring them up, people go, "Oh my God, that's right! I loved that person."
Right.
And if you can find, those are people that I'm always kind of like, who is a person like that? Yeah.
And go back to the Christmas special. So, did you say 68 million people watched this? 1976. That is. So this. Remember, ladies and gentlemen. Let's just go back in the Wayback Machine with Sherman and Mr. Peabody.
Yeah, yeah.
So, broadcast television back then was a mass audience structure. 3 networks. There were not a lot of choices. There weren't streaming alternatives. There weren't cable alternatives. But still, it was highly competitive because of that intense, segmented. So if you polled 68 million, you were literally polling 10 million viewers from 2 other networks.
Yeah.
At that hour.
It is. Listen, you're absolutely right. When people say, "Oh, there were only 3 networks," okay, that's fine. But also, the country was also significantly smaller.
Yes.
Okay, the country had, I think, probably, like 250
and the
million
competitive
people.
zeal to grab 1 million viewers, let alone 10 million from another network, was off the charts.
Yeah. And so when you watch this thing, it's very weirdly 70s. He's basically in a snow globe and a biosphere that they've built for him in the Rockies, and he's got like growies and greenies, as he calls them, inside. He has all this plant life inside, the whole thing. I'm not surprised. I'm imagining hanging macrame baskets are probably in there somewhere, and. He's got the biggest stars of the day. He's got Steve Martin in his Wild and Crazy Guy period, and Valerie Harper, Olivia Newton-John, and he just sort of sings songs. There's kind of it's cheerful, but there's also something kind of wan and sort of 70s about it.
And think about the psyche collectively of the country in 1976. Yes, it's a bicentennial year, but we're coming off Vietnam. We're wondering about what America means after 200 years. We are still dealing with the after effects of the civil rights movement, campus riots, all of those things. Watergate is just right in the rear view mirror. And this idea of almost like this snow globe commune.
Yep.
Sitting in the middle of living rooms across America found a place of traction, psychically.
I think people, you look at it and you think, People just needed a break.
Yeah.
People just needed a break. And even the way everyone in the audience shots, the reaction shots, I mean, there's a I wouldn't say a cult-like quality to it, but everyone looks mildly sedated. Like, and so, but what was everyone's doing? Valium. It's like it's like that crowd, and everyone's sort of naturally attractive. Like, no one seems to be wearing makeup, none of the women, and so, and he's sort of strumming his guitar, and they're having a sing-along.
And one of the things I love about the Mobituaries about John Denver, and I promise we'll get on to other parts of Mobituary Season 3, but I found this deeply meaningful to me because I had sort of overlooked John Denver until recently. Got the greatest hits on my iTunes. And we all remember, I certainly remember at the time, Rocky Mountain High having a kind of hilarious end joke. Rocky Mountain High, everyone's stoned. That's not what the song is about. And the first 3 stanzas of that song, I urged my audience, go back and listen to it. It is beautiful, evocative, life journey writing.
It really is. And I mean, yeah, and he went and he testified, in fact, during the Parents Music Research Council, right, the Tipper Gore hearings, what are commonly known as that, and said, you know, my song was not about that. It seems almost quaint now because no one would care today if they thought it was
But people
about
did
being
back
high.
then, and it was
People
sort of like
did.
an allegation against it, like a celebration of sitting around a campfire and just getting stoned, and that's all American youth could do, and how terrible that was, and we ought to do something about that.
No, arms akimbo, absolutely. No, no, it was his reaction to seeing the Perseid meteor shower from 12,000 feet up in the Rockies, and how beautiful that was to him.
Exactly, exactly. How is it that people like John Denver, and I imagine you've thought about this, because you're saying this person deserves a second look. Have you ever come to a unified theory about why they didn't get the good look the first time?
Well, I think it's probably different in every case. I think for John Denver, I do think that he would have been recognized more had he lived longer. And as you know, one of the in the podcast, Bill Flanagan, who's a great music writer, and I talk about how today he might be Dolly Parton. He might have been Dolly Parton.
This
had he
enduring
lived.
person with a great songbook that is a touchstone for lots of people
Yeah.
over many generations.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know what the statistics are, but I bet that the number of times his songs are played would probably surprise a lot of us, like how they're still played. So, yeah, I think he would be a figure like that. And so I'm not sure. I think it's different every time.
So who is Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and why did they rate a Mobituary?
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Smith rated a Mobituary because actually the producer of that episode, Zoe Marcus, had sent long ago an image of a Time magazine cover from 1967 that simply says Mr. and Mrs. Smith, an interracial marriage. And I remember being struck that I had not known the story, that Dean Rusk, the Georgia Democrat who was the Secretary of State under Kennedy and LBJ, that his daughter, who was white, married a black man in 1967, and that would have been put on the cover of Time magazine. And one of the details really jumped out at me, that Dean Rusk, her father, had offered his resignation to the president because he was worried that the publicity around it would compromise crucial Southern support in Congress for the president's agenda on, I guess, civil rights and Vietnam. But
that one marriage could be so galvanizing as to possibly jeopardize the political prospects of a president of the United States.
Right. But what also kind of captivated me was the idea of this young couple in love who end up on the cover of Time magazine and then are completely forgotten, which they were very happy about. They retired, they moved as young people to Central Virginia and raised horses all their lives. I mean, Peggy Rusk, the daughter of the Secretary of State, was not did not aspire to be a Washington doyen or social climber. She just had no interest in that. She found this guy, fell in love, they married, and they just wanted to get away from it all and be with horses, which is how they met.
And why is 1967 a particularly important year?
Because it ends up being this year where it starts with Loving versus Virginia and the unanimous ruling and that struck down bans in 16 states against mixed race marriages. And then you have this marriage in the middle, and then you have Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the huge box office success at the end of that year. And then there's a little detail that I thought was really interesting that Sidney Poitier.
I'm going to hold you right there because that interesting detail is a perfect segue and a grabber for the next segment of the Takeout.
And
that's what Mo Rocca is doing, and the Barada is here, and I'm Major Garrett, back for more of our deeply enjoyable conversation about Mobituaries Season 3 here on the Takeout.
And he was also a groundbreaking impressionist because he was a black impressionist imitating white actors.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back. This is not a rhetorical question. How delightful is it to spend the end of 2022 in the presence of Mo Rocca in Midtown New York? It's spectacular. I told you it was not a rhetorical question. Our subject matter is Mo Rocca, of course, Mobituaries. Midway through Season 3, we're talking about Mr. and Mrs. Smith. One of the things I found very interesting about that episode is Dean Rusk's daughter, who becomes Mrs. Smith, doesn't really think much of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the movie, which was, as you said, a box office sensation then, and is regarded as one of these turning point movies of its time.
Yeah.
And people who watch it now find great inspiration, substance, emotion, and a kind of clarity in it. But that didn't really land that way with her, it sounded like to me.
You know, it didn't, and I found her as a character so interesting because she was, and I'm sure when you encounter this, I'm guessing you're happy about it. She's like someone who's never watched TV because she doesn't have the cadence of a TV interviewee. She just answers, like she'll sometimes do like one-word answers, and she talks like a normal person. I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you being so normal? Like, you're supposed to talk like people do on TV and give these answers. You're supposed to give me the answers I'm expecting. What is wrong here? No, it's so, but what I also found sort of inspiring is kind of she had this clarity that she was in love with this guy, and that's all that mattered. She wasn't really. I was sort of taken aback when she said she wasn't following the Supreme Court case. Now, that's probably because she was in a state where she was in the District of Columbia and she was going to get married in California. There wasn't going to be an issue there in 1967.
Those rights were protected.
Yeah, but
still.
But she wasn't. She just says, "Look, I don't know what to tell you. I wasn't doing this to make a cultural impact or make a political point. I was doing it because I was in love." And when I interviewed the great entertainer Leslie Uggams, who married a white man, an Australian, 2 years before, in 1965, she sort of said the same thing. Like, you know, when you're in love with somebody, you're not really thinking about the social issue aspect of it. I mean, you know.
And that's maybe one of the ways you know it's really deep and abiding for them.
Right.
Because they're not distracted by all these other things. They just know what they are, and who they are, and what it means to be together.
Right, exactly.
And there's a abject beauty to that.
Completely. It's so pure.
And in its sort of plainness and ordinariness, it seems to me as I was listening, felt extraordinary.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you feel that way. Thank you, and thank her. But it's and I hope that that's why it's that it's landing with a lot of people who are sick of everything, every personal story becoming a political story necessarily,
right?
Because it just doesn't fit it that neatly.
And if you allow me, Mo, I'd like to reach back to season 2 to talk about Sammy Davis Jr. Because some in this audience may not have a real memory of Sammy Davis Jr. You have to be a person of a certain age, like you and I are. You and I grew up watching Sammy on television. And even then I knew he was amazing, but I didn't know until I listened to the show how highly he was regarded by the superstars of his time.
Yeah, he really was. When he was at Ciro's nightclub in Los Angeles, I mean, everyone wanted to get in and see him perform, and he was quite young then. He was primarily a dancer then, and and part of a nightclub act with his father and part of the Will Maston trio. But even then, people were fighting to get in and see this masterful performer. And then he lost his eye and he came back from that. But part of why I wanted to do him, just because, not just my admiration and affection, and call it Death of an Entertainer, is because entertainer, the word, sometimes people are a little kind of think it sounds a little cheeseball, but
they're dismissive of it.
Right. But to be a capital E entertainer like that, that's really special. To be somebody who performs, in Vegas and then goes back to his hotel room and does the whole act again with Liza Minnelli because they both just love performing. That's a certain drive and an energy that we all should be grateful for, to have that person in our lives.
And there's a theme in that Mobituary that I think is also important, because looking back at entertainers of that era, so in the TV era who made it big, they came out of vaudeville, which was a place that demanded not just one talent. You could not be successful in vaudeville as a single talent entertainer.
No, I mean, he was sort of a quintuple threat, I guess, actor, singer, dancer. He had the gun spinning routine, which was really amazing. He was also a really great impressionist. And he was also a groundbreaking impressionist because he was a black impressionist imitating white actors. And when he did that in the Army, after being physically beaten regularly, because he was part of the first wave of integrated forces, he was so good that even like the abusive white, soldiers who had bullied him and worse, were like, whoa, this guy is really special.
And one other theme that comes through subtly, but I think it's important because it's a hallmark of people who are successful in times when their success is harder than the people they are around. There was a tenacity to Sammy.
Yeah. There was a tenacity. He kept going, and I think also there's something. I find something. I actually, weirdly enough, was thinking a little bit of Ellen DeGeneres when I was doing this, because I remember when I profiled her that she said, I just want to make people laugh. I just want to be an entertainer, and she sort of got caught up in one point in politics and having, and she was okay being an advocate, but what she really wanted to do was entertain. And that's kind of Sammy Davis Jr. And by the way, Sammy Davis Jr. went and marched at Selma. He was on the March on Washington. And I think Harry Belafonte even said at one point, I don't understand why Sammy Davis Jr. doesn't get credit for that. And it's seen as somebody who sort of shirked that, which he didn't. But maybe it's because he was so first and foremost an entertainer and loved doing that.
There might be one answer. It's referred to in the episode. I remember it in my household growing up when he endorsed Richard Nixon.
Well, right. Yeah. And that may be one reason.
That was a moment for my Republican parents.
Yeah. Right. Right.
I'm serious.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
It was a moment.
Yeah.
And they said, see? Richard Nixon must be fine. This amazing... We did not use the terminology African American at that time.
Yeah.
This amazing black American has endorsed Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
Good enough for Sammy, good enough for us, even in '72. Yeah,
That's
it was a
funny.
moment. And you mentioned in the episode that there was a little bit of, hey, what are you doing, among white liberals and maybe some in the civil rights community.
Yeah. No, there was. And then he
gives this great speech
to
where
the
it says,
Push conference, right?
I am who I am.
Right. Yeah.
I'm a black man in America, and I've made a choice.
Right. And it was, and I really loved talking to Willie Brown about that, who is, by the way, just one of the greatest interviews ever. He talked about an individual.
Yes.
I mean,
and as sharp an observer, and he has, to pick up on something you said earlier, a gut sense of politics that is very, very good, very sharp. Always has.
Yeah.
And he had sort of a 360 view of Sammy.
He really did, and he also really pushed back at the notion that Sammy might have been deficient because he was so much about entertainment. He was like, no, he was a great cook. He was a film lover. He was a really sophisticated guy and a great host. So it was. I loved hearing his perspective.
So when we think about, because we're going to be anticipating 2023 in a lot of different ways, what should we think about? What can you set the table at for coming up from Obituaries in the second part of season 3.
Well, I really wanted to tell the story of Samantha Smith, whom you probably remember, but an astonishing number of people have forgotten that in 1983, this young girl from Maine, she wasn't connected, she wrote a letter. Like, how many kids were kept awake at night during the 80s and 70s, I'm sure, terrified that the world was going to be blown up, right? That the Soviet Union and America would trade, ICBMs, and she wrote a letter to Yuri Andropov.
And with that, another teaser. Mo is at the top of his game. Always at the top of his game. I'm Major Garrett. That's Mo Rocca. Stay tuned for segment 4, because that's a great teaser when we get back.
I had two fears at that time, myself as an adolescent, that the world would be destroyed by nuclear attack, and that by the time I moved to New York, there would be no, Broadway.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Always fantastic to be in New York City. Even better when I get to sit down for a meal with Mo Rocca. So, Mo, you were talking about a letter.
Well, right. Do you remember towards the end of the Soviet Union, there were like a succession of really scary ghouls at the top, right? It went Brezhnev.
Sitting atop the Supreme Soviet. Yes.
Yeah. It went Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, right? Those were the three.
Yeah.
I mean, Brezhnev had been there a long time, but Andropov was like particularly a caricature of a scary guy because he'd run the KGB, right? So this girl, Samantha Smith, wrote this letter saying, why do you want to blow up the world, basically? And he wrote her back. The letter was published in Pravda, and said, we don't want that, and people all over the world are the same, blah, 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 and come visit the Soviet Union. And so she went, and CBS News covered the hell out of it. It was a very big deal. But what I found in previous seasons of the podcast is people under a certain age, really not that much younger than me, but had no clue. And one of the producers said, no, you've got to do this episode because no one, I'm telling you, no millennials know this story at all.
Not only know that story, but have any sense of, and you mentioned this before we went to break, and it might have struck people, what? The terror. The psychic heaviness that came with the Cold War. And in the 70s and 80s, almost once a month, there was a story written about the ever-enlarging stockpiles of nuclear weapons and how many times over one side or another could obliterate planet Earth. That was heavy. It was real. And it weighed on you every single day.
It weighed on you. And so when I hear about kids who have climate anxiety, I take that seriously when I hear that kids have trouble sleeping because they're worried that the planet is going to be destroyed, and that the cities, the places where they live, will be submerged by the oceans. And I thought that's what it was. That sort of
felt existential.
It felt existential, and I had two fears at that time. Myself as an adolescent, that the world would be destroyed by nuclear attack, and that Broadway was just not economically viable as a model, and that by the time I moved to New York, there would be no, Broadway. So those two things were really weighing on me. Samantha Smith did nothing for the Broadway community. I'm sure she knows, but
thankfully it's still here, and going strong. Thank goodness.
But she did something remarkable, and she was just a kid, an ordinary kid, and the trip there was really interesting because that was not easy to comport herself the way she did. And so that story has been really interesting to tell.
So one of the things that I find so enjoyable about Mobituaries is not only is it a second look, but it's a closer look at the first two lines of the original obituary, if you will. Because everyone who achieves some level of notoriety, this is true, ladies and gentlemen, I've done it, you wonder, all right, when I die, what's the first or second line going to be about me? Anyone who denies that is not being honest with themselves, and they're not being honest with you. Okay? And so you look at that lead, and you say, is that true? Yes, but. Or, did that completely miss it, or miss it by more than it should have? It seems to me that's one of the exercises you go through in the process.
Well, I appreciate that because I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I'd like to think that that's what we are doing with it. I hope so. I think you're right. It is interesting to see what that little, is it in a positive? I forget what the grammatical term for it is, but Joe Schmo, comma, comma, died today.
Right.
He was 68 or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. What is that thing that is the essence?
Yeah.
What is the contemporary essence of this person? Maybe right, maybe incomplete, maybe more wrong than right. And it seems to me that's one of the things you're trying to excavate.
Yeah, and look, that changes with, different eras because, a while back when Jerry Lee Lewis died, some of the I could see that some of the obits were balancing his legendary career as a rock and roller with his personal life in trying to smush it in there.
Mm-hmm.
An earlier era would not have worried about the personal side. I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. What is that? Is there? Oh, thank you so much. That's fine. That's fine. So, yeah.
Wine break.
Yeah,
Wine. Actually, no, it's not a wine break, but it is a break in the video action,
Yeah.
which is we're at Trattoria dell'Arte in Midtown Manhattan. It's a
This is real,
functioning,
folks.
moving, wine-indulgent restaurant. So that's great.
This is not a rehearsal.
No, it's not.
It's the kids say, right? Yeah.
And
this is not a drill. That's not what they say. Yeah.
And it's an appraisal plus more. And what do you find about the podcast space that gives you that elbow room?
Well, I think certainly the space, the time, that you can take, which I don't want to abuse that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes on streaming shows, you think, well, maybe you could have used a network exec telling you, sorry.
5 episodes, not 8.
Yeah, exactly. 40 minutes, not 70. Like,
Right.
you didn't need that.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I think there's room for that. I also think, probably sometimes for intense interviews, not, showing up with just a microphone, people will open up a little bit
Without
more.
Without question.
I think so.
And one of the things that I find, and you will probably feel humble about this in a way that I don't intend, like, oh, Major, what are you saying that for? But you have convening authority. There are people who will talk to you that enlarge this project and these concepts, it feels to me.
Well, I hope so. That is nice of you to say that, and I hope so. I hope as people listen to more episodes or see interviews that they like that I've done, that it will make them more open to it. I know with John Denver that there was a lot of protectiveness around him, and I thought, all right.
But who is the leading character of that episode? His ex-wife,
right?
Annie.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that had to take some doing.
It did. I think she needed to know that this was coming from, I know it sounds corny, but from a place of love. And
Right.
it is.
Right.
It is. Which, there's a way, from a place of love to get to make discoveries.
And in the last minute or so we have, Mo, it feels also that one of the things you want to help people understand is that there is an American story. It has lots of characters. There are
Yeah.
lots of complexities to it. And we should spend some time with it.
Yeah. Yes. And I want to tell more of those stories. And, because I really like America. and think there are a lot of great stories and there are a lot of things to be happy and proud about. And, there are a lot of heroes, and I don't want it to be hokey, and
Right.
sure. I hope there are many more episodes so that we can keep telling stories about people who overcame struggles and achieved great things in part because they were here.
I can't say no one hopes more than I that there will be more episodes, because there probably is one person who hopes more than I. But I'm right near the top, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great, great, immersive, beautiful piece of work. Mobituaries. Second part of season 3 is coming your way. Mo, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Major. I love this. Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
And she went, "We do not insult people on this show." And she made the caller apologize. And how far we've fallen.
Yeah.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. You know who I am, Major Garrett. We're winding up the year 2022. We're in Midtown Manhattan. Trattoria dell'Arte is the restaurant. Mo Rocca is our special guest. We are talking about Mobituaries, one of the greatest podcasts going. That's a fact. Not an assertion, not a representation. Fact. Take it from me.
The news
How's that? Did I do it? Will the check clear now, Mo?
The news is back. Are we still using that? So, the news is back, and so we only deal with facts.
So, Jamie Benson, who's behind the camera with us this episode and running audio, and who is an integral part of Mobituary Parties, and has been part of my success in the debrief and the takeout for the better part of 6 years, had an idea, and you latched onto it. So let's roll with this a little bit. He said, Major, why don't you think of a possible Mobituary?
I love that.
Can I suggest one?
Please.
Curt Flood.
Who is Curt Flood?
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
I'm already intrigued.
Curt Flood played Major League Baseball. He played Major League Baseball for the St. Louis Cardinals. He was an all-star outfielder.
Jeez, the Cardinals.
African American. Mm-hmm. Curt Flood went to federal court to challenge the reserve clause, which was something that existed in Major League Baseball until Curt Flood came along. What was the reserve clause? It said every Major League Baseball team reserved the right to keep you on their roster until they changed their mind. You could never opt out of your contract for the perpetuity of your Major League career. Curt Flood said that disabled him and every other Major League Baseball player from their rights to test their value among other teams. Curt Flood went to federal court, won his case, and began the era of free agency.
Free agency.
Yes.
So that's how we got free agency.
Correct.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no idea. Well, I'm instantly drawn to it also because I know how Cardinal fans are just so fervent, and which makes them really
and they're the
interesting.
best baseball fans in the country.
Yeah.
I've been to many baseball games in St. Louis, and they know the game. They are deeply appreciative, and Missouri has a complicated history in our country.
Sure.
With race relations dating all the way back to pre-Civil War times. The Dred Scott case originates in part in Missouri. Curt Flood is an enormously important part of the American story and the assertion of rights and the searching for rights in a different context, athletics, but was enormously important to the game we see before us today.
Love that. Great.
So that's one suggestion.
Great. What else you got? we got we got seasons to fill. I need more material.
Now, this can't happen yet because he's still with us. But when the day comes, and I hope it's not soon, I believe Jerry Brown would deserve an examination for his multi-decade career in politics that has more twists and turns than I think anyone comparable.
Well, and also Jerry Brown, I mean, at one point he went and worked in Calcutta with Mother Teresa.
Yes.
I mean, he's had a really
He's had a
interesting
fascinating life, and he was this Roman candle in American politics early in his career, and he's very reflective about the mistakes he made and the hubris that came with it. Then, and this is one of the things that I'm drawn to, not ideologically, not because of party, but because of, I believe people who stay in the arena deserve appraisal for staying in the arena, because it's not easy to stay in the arena. He was very high, and then he went back and became a mayor in a very tough city to be a mayor.
Oakland. Right.
Way up high, back down low, and then served and understood, and he learned more about being a good leader and being a good deliverer of services to a community. Then he rose to Attorney General, then he became governor again, and ushered California into its sort of modern future. I just think he is someone who spans decades and isn't rigid in any of those particular decades.
Well, and I love that that he went from governor to being mayor. It reminds me a little bit of John Quincy Adams going from president to a House rep, and that being his happiest time, actually, as a House rep. And And didn't Jerry Brown dated Deborah Winger also? So
Linda Ronstadt?
Linda Ronstadt, sorry.
Yes.
Bob Carey dated Deborah Winger. Did
Indeed.
they both date Deborah Winger? I don't want to do that to Deborah Winger. But anyway.
Linda Ronstadt.
Everyone dated Deborah Winger. No, Linda Ronstadt, of course. But yeah, no, what an interesting life. Well, we wish him well. We wish you well, Jerry Brown.
Absolutely. I'm not
Yeah.
prematurizing that, if that's even a word, but I do think there is something worth saying about Jerry Brown because he occupies different, and he is an embodiment of the 70s in a certain way, a caricature of that time, and you either stuck with that or you matured out of it, and I think that journey is interesting.
God, how far we've fallen. I remember in 1992 when he was in the primary against Bill Clinton.
That was the first presidential campaign I covered.
Oh, okay. And I remember listening to WAMU, I think it was still called there, and Diane Rehm, and somebody called up and went, well, Governor Moonbeam, and then she went, we do not insult people on this show. And she made the caller apologize. And how far we've fallen. Because now everyone just insults each other all the time.
Yes,
but then that was
proof
like,
of your authenticity to insult.
Right. Yeah.
I'm authentic and I don't insult. I'm Major Garrett. Mo Rocca, what a pleasure. Thanks, man.
And you're not, and I'm eating anchovies and you're not insulting me.
Not at all. No.
That says
you
something.
go for it because I'm not touching them, Mo. Not today, not ever. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week.